right, Daniel chapter 6. Daniel chapter 6, the famed account of Daniel and the lion's den. I think this is kind of an interesting story, interesting account, a true account. And, some of these, I wish I had, $5 million, some high-tech equipment, and a movie studio all my own, because just the way my mind works, this would be fun to put all of this into a movie and actually get it right, as opposed to the majority of what Hollywood does. It really is quite miraculously, and there are some things, I guess there'd be kind of little nuances in here that are really kind of comical when you think about what's going on with the circumstance. But here in Daniel chapter 6, we are ending the narrative section. This is the last real narrative of the book of Daniel. From chapter 7 to 12, and I'm really looking forward to 7 to 12 because this is all going to start dealing with Bible prophecy again, and there is a lot of details. When we get a little bit farther into chapter, I think it's number 11, people talk about the 400 silent years between Malachi and John the Baptist. They actually were not silent years. They were very busy years, and it's all prophesied for us in the book of Daniel and tells us everything down to the minute detail of what goes on during that 400 years that transpires between those two places in our Bible. Now, we want to remember that Daniel chapters 1 through 12 are not completely sequential. And if you don't recognize that when you're reading through the book of Daniel, it can kind of throw you off. Chapters 1 to 6 are in order, and chapters 7 to 12 are in order, but they're not necessarily in sequential order, if that makes sense. So if we took it sequentially, it would be chapters 1 through 4, then we would have chapters 7 through 8, chapter 5, chapter 9, chapter 6, and chapters 10 through 12. So in essence, what's going on, Daniel 1 to 6 gives us the narrative of essentially the life of Daniel, and chapters 7 to 12 are prophecies that took place during that period of time. Just when Daniel put this together, he did it in two different sections because he wanted to designate this as narrative and this section as prophetic. So I hope that makes sense. So to help us understand a little bit, by the time we come to chapter 6 here, Daniel chapter 9 has already taken place. Daniel's prophecy where he's praying for his people and the angel comes to him and tells him what's going to happen to his people and how they're going to be released, and he's realizing, hey, the time of our 70 years is coming up. That's already taken place. Cyrus has already let the Jews return to Israel to begin to build the temple. Now, a number of Jews have stayed behind. They've stayed in various other cities within what was the Babylonian Empire. That's where, like the book of Esther and such, take place. So Cyrus, or Darius, as he's referred to here, has already sent the Jews back by this time. So Daniel and just a few Jews are left here in Babylon by the time we come to chapter 6. And so this chapter now is going to end the trilogy of We Three Kings of Orient Are. And this is a real story because what we have here is a tale of three kings. Only these three kings were not bringing gifts from afar to baby Jesus. And what we see in this trilogy, though, and what the emphasis is here, is that it is the sovereign God does as he pleases in all of the affairs of men. There's nothing going on that God is not already in control of. And that is something that is very relieving. Because when we think of all the chaos that's going on, and we think of the next election that's coming up, and all the things that could happen and are probably going to happen, it's good to know that somebody is in control. God is working all things together, moving history along to his predetermined plan. Nations come and go. They're all working according to a predestined plan of God for history. Nothing is taking God by surprise. Whatever comes, God is well aware of it. We look and say, God, what are you going to do anything about this? And God looks down and says, I'm working my plan out. You just trust me during this time. Not that we shouldn't vote, not that we shouldn't hope that a certain Democratic nominee get. You can vote for the Republican if you. No, kidding. Not that we shouldn't do those things, but we need to understand too that whatever happens, whatever's the outcome, God is still in control, and God sets up kings and he puts them down. Chapter 6 now is going to begin the second phase of the 4 empires that we saw back in chapter 2 that describes the times of the Gentiles. In chapter 6, we are introduced to these 3 kings. In these 6 chapters, we're introduced to 3 kings from 2 different kingdoms. We're introduced to Nebuchadnezzar early on, and he began as a proud king. He's high and lifted up. He's up at the top, and Daniel and his people and his God are way down at the bottom. He thinks that because he's conquered Israel, because his kingdom is so vast that all this is his doing, all of it is his accomplishment, that he's been the one in charge of all this, but God is going to bring him low. He's going to give him the mind like an animal. His kingdom is going to be removed, and he is going to learn what Daniel 4:17 says, that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, he giveth it to whomsoever he will. In chapter 5, we're introduced to Belshazzar. He knew the history of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. He knew everything that had gone on, yet he failed to learn the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned. He failed to learn that the Most High is the one that is in charge, and rather than humbling himself, he lifted up his heart in pride against God and even challenged God, and his story ends with the fall of the Babylonian Empire and his own death. Now in chapter 6, we're introduced to the 3rd king, beginning the 2nd phase of the times of the Gentiles under Darius. And one thing to note in all of this is that there really is no one nation that is actually significant when it is set against God's plan and eternity. Even America. While I love America and I'm thankful for the freedoms that we have, and I'm thankful for the men that have given their lives so we can have the liberties that we're supposed to have, even America is really not all that significant in light of eternity and the plan of God. In fact, this is how God describes them in Isaiah chapter 40, verse 15. Behold, the nations are as a drop of a bucket, and are counted as the small dust of the balance. Behold, he taketh up the isles as a very little thing. Now, isles, we're not talking about like Bermuda and Fiji. When the Bible talks about isles, it can, in a real sense, be referring to, like we would think of America, because it's referring to anything that is out across the ocean. So any nation, he says, it's just like a drop in a bucket. That's not very significant. Or like if you have scales where you're weighing things, the little dust particles that are on those scales, those don't amount to anything. They don't change anything at all. That's how God views the nations. They're nothing. In Isaiah chapter 40, verse 7 and 8, he compares them to grass that withers because the Spirit of the Lord blows upon them. And when you consider the great leaders of the past, the rulers, the kingdoms, all of them have passed away. But God's work always continues because God rules the course of history. That cannot change. Babylon now has fallen. The times of the Gentiles moves to the next phase, and Daniel is right smack dab where God wants him to be. And God is not hindered in the decisions of men, no matter what decision they make. And that's one of the things that I think is so interesting. When you look at the crucifixion, for instance, of Christ, and it says that they cast lots and parted his garments. It's interesting what the gospel writers say, that it might be fulfilled. They didn't realize they were doing it. They thought, we're just going to part these garments. This is nice. So, well, maybe we won't split this one. We'll cast lots to see who can win this one in a game of dice. But all along, God said, this is my plan. I am fulfilling my plan, and you have no idea what's going on. You are not hindering what's going on one bit. It's kind of like one of those things, who gets the last laugh? God does. Bible even says, he that sitteth in the heavens shall laugh. That's exactly what's going on. Daniel, remember, Daniel's at this party, well, just after the party, he's there to interpret this, the writing that's on the wall there for Belshazzar, and after he's done interpreting it, Cyrus comes in with his army and kills the king, but then Daniel is spared because Daniel brought this scroll of the book of Isaiah in. And so, and it talks about Cyrus in there. So he's impressed by this. He spares Daniel. And Daniel, who was once, in essence, the prime minister of the kingdom of Babylon, now is transferred as the prime minister of the kingdom of Medo-Persia. And it's interesting to know, too, that at this time, Daniel is somewhere between 85 and 90, probably pushing close to 90 years old. And that's pretty impressive. This guy, he's still bold. He's not afraid of anything, and he's still serving God and being faithful, doing exactly what God wants him to do. Now, this totally goes against the American mindset, because in America, we think 55, 60, it's time for me to retire. I'm done with all this. I'm just going to take a back seat and somebody else can do it. But most of the greatest works in history have been done by people over 80. At 83, Gladstone became the fourth-time Prime Minister of Great Britain. And that's kind of an interesting time to go into politics, or to be continuing in politics. Usually you think you might retire a little before then. Michelangelo painted his most famous painting, The Last Judgment, at the age of 89. John Wesley at 88 was still preaching eloquently and traveled over 250,000 miles by foot, horseback, and sailboat, preached over 4,000 sermons, and wrote many, many volumes of books at the age of 88. Edison was still inventing at 90. Frank Lloyd Wright was still considered to be a creative architect at the age of 90. And J.C. Penney, a faithful Christian, was still strenuously working from his desk at 95 years old. A person may retire from their secular work, but that doesn't mean that we retire from the service of God. Doesn't mean we're done serving the Lord. In fact, this is what Paul says. He says, in 1 Corinthians 7, but as God hath distributed to every man, as the Lord hath called every one, so let him walk, and so ordain I in all the churches. He says, let every man abide in the same calling wherein he is called. Art thou called being a servant? Or we could say a slave, or even an employee. He says, care not for it. Don't worry about that. But if thou mayest be made free, use it rather. It says, take the opportunity to be made free, to get out from underneath a master. For he that is called in the Lord being a servant is the Lord's free man. He says, even if you're a servant, if you're employed, if you're a slave even, you are God's free man. You can still do a work for God in that circumstance. It says, likewise also he that is called being free. The person who is out from underneath of a master. He is Christ's servant. He says, ye are bought with a price, be not ye the servants of men. Brethren, let every man abide, every man wherein he is called there and abide with God. That's the point. Whether you are a servant, whether you are under an employer, or whether you are out from under an employer, your chief responsibility still is to serve God and to be faithful to Him. Use the opportunity that you do have. And so this is exactly what Daniel did. Daniel was always faithful. Always doing exactly what God wanted him to do, and he really wasn't worried about the consequences when it came down to it. And notice here, firstly, the promotion of Daniel, verse number 1. It says, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. Now, let's just think about this for a minute. Who was Darius? And actually, his name, I think, is properly pronounced Darius, but it's hard to say that. I like Darius better. It's easier. Really, there's no historical backing for any man named Darius. Some want to say, well, it was Cyrus's kind of chief executive or one of the generals of his army whose name was Gubaru. How would you like to have that as a name? It's like somebody calling you Goober. Really glad to live in America. And he wasn't a king, but he was appointed as a ruler by Cyrus, and some people think that that is who Darius is referring to. Cyrus was kind of over the entire empire, and Gubaru is over the area of Babylon until Cyrus comes and claims that part of the kingdom. Others say, and I would agree with this myself, is that Darius is just another name for Cyrus. Darius is actually not a proper name. It is a title, much like Pharaoh or Caesar. Those were not names of people, but they were titles given to many different men over the course of time. And so Darius is a title that is given by the Medes and the Persians, and Cyrus is his Persian name. If you look down to verse 28, there's something interesting here. Verse 28 says, "So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian." And so that would make it appear that we are talking about two different people in two different reigns. But actually the word "and" there is being used to emphasize the fact that these are the same guy, these are the same kingdom. That it is the reign of Darius and it is the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So some people want to discredit the Bible because of this, but actually the way Daniel wrote this in here, it is proving the historical accuracy of the Bible. And plus, this Darius has the authority to appoint 123 men over the kingdom to have a specific charge. So this guy isn't just a local leader. This guy has to be in a place of very high authority to be able to be making these decisions empire-wide. So I think it's Cyrus. If you disagree, that's fine. When you teach Daniel, then you call him whatever you want to call him. But right now, Cyrus and Darius are the same guy. So we got 120 princes that are basically put over the kingdom. Then verse 2 says, "And over these, the 120, there are 3 presidents," or there's 3 chiefs, so to speak, "of whom Daniel was the first." Now that means that he has the highest position, which is really interesting because later on we find that he makes mentions that he's one of the captives. He's one of the slaves. He's one of these foreign people. He's not one of us. These other 122 guys, they're all local guys. So how do you think this goes over when this guy who was made a captive, I mean, we conquered his people, and now he is made first? He is above those who are above the aboves, and he's second to the king. How do you think that goes over? Well, it goes over just like a lead balloon. That's exactly how. In fact, this whole account of Daniel going into the lion's den is these men trying to get rid of Daniel because they cannot stand the fact that this foreigner is set over top of us, that he has authority and charge over us. They don't like it at all. And notice there in verse 2, it says, "Presidents of whom Daniel was the first, that the princes might give accounts unto them, and the king should have no damage." So the princes, their responsibility, these 120 princes, were set over the kingdom, and what they were to do is they were basically enforcing the laws of the king, and they are tax collectors. That's what they're doing. That's what it means that they might give accounts unto them. So the princes are taking accounts from people. They're collecting taxes. And these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one of them, their responsibility is to babysit these princes, to make sure that they're not embezzling from the king, so the king's not losing out on anything, that his coffers are not damaged at all. That's what it's referring to. So these 3 men, Daniel and whoever the other 2 guys are, these aren't just random guys that were selected by the king for this task. These men were very trusted and proved men, which means that the king knew very well a lot about Daniel and the type of man that he was. And notice here in verse 3, he says, "Then this Daniel was preferred above the presidents and princes." He was more distinguished. The king liked this guy more than the rest. Why? Because an excellent spirit was found in him. He had a good attitude. And when you think of everything that Daniel's been through, and at 15, taken out of his country against his will, probably more than likely saw his parents killed before his eyes. Then he's brought into a foreign country, a people and Gentiles at that, people that they absolutely despised. And then he's castrated, and then he's made to be a servant in the palace. And that might cause you to be tempted to have a pretty bad attitude for quite a long time. But not Daniel. Daniel maintained a good attitude through this whole thing. An excellent spirit was found in him. And notice what the reward was for that. And the king thought to set him over the whole realm. That's pretty high. He was going to be elevated. He's not going to be a prince. He's not going to be a president. He's going to be right under the king. He is going to be the one who has authority over the entire realm. Much like Joseph with Pharaoh. This is exactly what the plan is. This is the plan. God has elevated Daniel in the eyes of Darius. And why not? I mean, he has an impressive resume, does he not? He had the experience. I mean, if you're looking for somebody for an important job like this, you want somebody with experience. And he was the prime minister under Nebuchadnezzar, and probably for those 7 years that Nebuchadnezzar was insane, Daniel is the one ruling the kingdom, as we talked about a couple weeks ago. He had wisdom above all the others. He had leadership ability. He had administrative ability. He could interpret dreams. And why would you not want Daniel to be the vice president, so to speak? You know, when it came down to it, Darius wasn't putting Daniel in his position because he was a slave. He wasn't worried about what nationality he was. He was just choosing the best man for the job. So obviously, this isn't a union thing that's going on here. Darius is looking for the best man for the job. But notice there's a plot against Daniel. Notice in verses 4 through 9. And when one of the things that you often see is that when people are placed in a prominent position, it always comes with a price. Anytime somebody's lifted up and elevated, and we see this all the time, right, in the workplace. You have somebody who, a boss gets fired or he retires, and then the next guy that comes in, he could be the right man for the job, but nobody likes it. Why him, not me? Well, it might just be the fact that he's a better worker than you. It might just be the fact that he's been here for 30 years and knows what he's doing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a very qualified guy or just some guy off the street that just happened to get lucky and get promoted. It doesn't matter, because the fact that he's elevated and other people are not, those people are not going to like him. But the elevation always comes with a price. In essence, that person becomes a slave to whatever it is that they are doing in their work. They get wrapped up in the work. Whether they're a doctor, whether they're a lawyer, whether they're a theologian, whether they're a teacher, they always, in essence, become a slave. They are totally wrapped up and flooded and drowning, almost, it seems like sometimes, in their work. It's the only thing that they're doing. And when a person is elevated by God, and God gives His blessing to that person, it comes with a price as well. That person is going to be dogged by envy. I remember when I was in Bible college and getting close to the end, I really struggled with this whole envy thing. And I have to watch myself with it sometimes too, because some of my classmates, they're getting asked to come on staff at the church and at the college and with the other things that the church had going on. And you know what's going on in my heart? Why them and why not me? And my thought at the time is, I know the Bible better than they do. I got better grades in all my classes. I have more character. I work harder than they do. Why them and not me? And that was the exact problem right there. Big head. Paul had the problem with people being envious about him. In fact, in Philippians chapter 1, he talks about how people were preaching Christ out of envy and not sincerely, for the specific purpose that they wanted to make his prison sentence all the worse. Some people were coming behind Paul even and trying to undo all the work that he had already done. But it always happens when God elevates people, when God blesses someone, somebody else is going to be enraged by them. And so these men, these 122 other guys begin to look for something. They begin to nitpick. They begin to look for one thing. Let's see if we can find one thing to disqualify him from his position. Let's see if we can find one thing that we can bring to the king and just get rid of this guy and be done with him forever. Because, well, we know that the 3 Hebrews before in the fiery furnace, they made it through, but we're not under Babylon anymore. Now it's Medo-Persia, and they do the lion's den thing. So we are sure to get rid of him now. And so verse number 4. Then the presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom. Notice this, but they could find none occasion nor fault. That word fault means disobedience. First thing they looked for is he disobedient to the king in any way? As a citizen of the kingdom of Medo-Persia, is he violating any of the laws as a citizen? Couldn't find anything. And he kept the speed limit right where it was supposed to be. You know, his chariot didn't go above 15 miles an hour or whatever. They could find no fault. For as much as he was faithful, now notice this, neither was there any error or fault. That word error refers to neglecting his responsibilities. So, okay, as a president, is he neglecting any of his responsibilities? Is there paperwork that he's not getting turned in on time? You know, maybe he's taking a little too much time on his cell phone when he's supposed to be working, or maybe he's, talking with the other guys over the water cooler instead of doing his job. So they are just nitpicking. Look, it's kind of like when the boss gets the memo that we have to make layoffs because we don't have enough money to have all these people employed. And instead of getting rid of the guys at the bottom of the totem pole, they begin to nitpick every single person, looking for any reason whatsoever to try to get rid of that person. This is exactly what these men are doing. But Daniel was so diligent and faithful to what God had appointed him to do that they couldn't find anything wrong with what Daniel was doing. And really, whatever it is that we set our hands to do, that is exactly the way we're supposed to be. We should be the best and most faithful workers and examples in our communities. That's exactly the way God wants us to be. But they can't find anything. And so, they devise a plan. Notice verse number 5. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against this Daniel. So they've been looking, and finally they all regroup. It's like, man, we're not going to find anything against him unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The only way we're going to find anything wrong with Daniel is if somehow we get a law put in place that goes contrary to the law of his God. I mean, what a commendation to have. That the only thing that is wrong with you is that you are sold out to God? Now, there could be worse things. How many of us would have that type of commendation that the only thing people in our community could find against us, or people in the workplace could find against us, is that we're too spiritual? We're too godly. We never neglected any of our responsibilities. We were exemplary citizens, perfect. And the only thing that they could find against us, he's just too dedicated. That was Daniel. The only way we're going to get this, guys, if we get the king to pass some law that makes what Daniel's doing illegal. And because we know he's so faithful, he'll do it anyway, even though it is illegal. The problem is that far too often, people that we work with and that we are around don't know who we are as Christians because too often we're just like them. I mean, think about it. If it became illegal to be a Christian and one of us was arrested, would there be enough evidence to convict us? Now think about it for a moment. Would there be enough evidence, not just that you say you're a Christian, but by your words and by your life, would they know this is a person that is sold out to God? Notice verse number 6. Then these presidents and princes assembled. It's kind of like a riot when it says assembled. They're going to burst in. So these presidents and princes assembled or burst in together to the king and said thus on him, King Darius, live forever. All. Now, you know when somebody starts saying that, you always, or you never, you know there's a lie coming. Because it's not always true. Maybe not always, but most of the time, you know a lie's coming. Verse 7, all the princes of the kingdom, the governors and the princes, presidents of the kingdom, governors, princes, the counselors, the captains, have consulted together to establish a royal statute. And you know right off this is a lie. Did they consult Daniel, do you think? Do you think they asked Daniel, hey, Daniel, look, for 30 days, nobody's allowed to ask anything of any other god except the king. I'm sure Daniel would have been all for that. Did they consult him? No. Daniel didn't even know about it at this point. And notice there he says, so here's the royal statute, and to make a firm decree that whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days, save of thee, O king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, to us, this kind of seems ludicrous. That, in essence, this is worship. That for 30 days, nobody's going to be able to pray, ask anything of any god or man but you. But in this time, and in this religion, really, they made gods like men all the time. Gods that were feeble, gods that were weak, gods that were fallible. They made them all the time. They made gods in their own image. And so we can look at that and think it's a crazy idea, but to these people, this isn't all that far-fetched. They're used to this. In fact, the pharaohs of Egypt and the Caesars of Rome, they considered themselves to be gods. So what's going on is they would make gods in their own image, as Romans 1 talks about. And so this is exactly what's going on. And for the king, this is a good idea too. I'm a new king in this area. What better way to unify the kingdom than to abolish any other worship, and if anybody needs anything, they have to come to me for 30 days, and I'll give it to them. Kind of sounds like socialism too, but that's another subject for another day. And so I think the king was flattered by this. This is a great idea. And so verse 8, now, O king, and they meant now. This is something we have to do right away. This is a pressure appeal that's going on. Now, O king, establish a decree and sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the laws of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. And so the law of the Medes and the Persians, once something was written into law, it could never be changed. You had to write another law that could kind of counteract it. So once a law is in place, the king himself was subject to that law. Unlike Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, he could make a law and he was above the law. He didn't have to obey his own laws. But with the Medes and Persians, everybody was subject to it. There was no changing it. And so that was kind of instituted so that laws wouldn't be passed often. So kings would be real slow to really think about it. But that's not what happens here. His ego gets in the way. And notice verse 9, he says, wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. Well, that's not good. What's Daniel going to do once he hears about this? Okay. I guess for 30 days, I'm not going to pray anymore. 30 days, I'm not going to be faithful to my God. 30 days, I'm just going to whatever. But notice here, in verses 10 through 15, we see Daniel's perseverance. In verse 10, he says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went into his house, and his windows being open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, he kneeled upon his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he did aforetime. Now, I want you to notice that phrase at the end. As he did aforetime. He was steadfast in his praying, not because all of a sudden now it's illegal to do it, so now I'm going to use my rights as an American citizen, and I'm going to exercise those rights now that it's illegal. Daniel had already been praying 3 times a day on his knees with his window open toward Jerusalem. This was the way he lived his life since he got to Babylon. Nothing was going to change for Daniel. Just like he had always been doing, Daniel continued to pray. He didn't do it just because the law was now signed into place. He did it because he was not going to allow the law to interrupt the commitment that he already had. So he prayed toward Jerusalem. That was a practice that was instituted as a result of the captivity. Solomon makes mention of it in 1 Kings chapter 8, that when the people sin and they get carried away into other nations, if they will pray toward Jerusalem, then you will hear and deliver them. So Daniel is identifying with his people. He is confessing the sins of his people. 3 times a day he would pray. And that wasn't just a ritual. The idea actually comes from Psalm 55. And in Psalm 55, David makes mention of the voice of the enemy, the oppression of the wicked, the false accusation and hatred of his enemies. He speaks of the threat of death. He speaks of being overwhelmed with fear. All things that Daniel is experiencing at this moment. This is why he is doing this. And in verse 16 it says, "As for me," this is Psalm 55, verse 16. "As for me, I will call upon God, and the Lord shall save me. Evening and morning and at noon will I pray and cry aloud, and he shall hear my voice. He hath delivered my soul in peace from the battle that was against me. For there were many with me. God shall hear and afflict them, even he that abideth of old, because they have no changes," or there's no disruption in their life, "therefore they fear not God." Verse 22 says, "Cast thy burden upon the Lord, and he shall sustain thee. He shall never suffer the righteous to be moved. But thou, O God, shalt bring them down into the pit of destruction. Bloody and deceitful men shall not live out half their days, but I will trust in thee." So this is exactly where Daniel is at right now. And if anybody could identify with the psalmist of Psalm 55, it was Daniel at this point. This has been his attitude since he got to Babylon. He is in a foreign place, enemies around him, a pagan land. He has hardships because of his devotion to God the entire time he is there. But yet he was going to trust the Lord to uphold him. He was going to trust the Lord to sustain him, and he was going to trust the Lord to deal with his enemies. And this is what is about to happen right here in this story. Because of the opposition, he had the custom of praying more, not less. He didn't start now because it was against the law. He was faithful in his responsibilities. He was faithful in his responsibilities as a citizen, faithful in his responsibilities to the king, until the law of the king violated God's law. And then, like Peter says, we ought to obey God rather than man. Now, for 30 days, Daniel could have changed things up, couldn't he have? And he could have, instead of kneeling down with his window open, he could have just walked around and prayed silently for 30 days and kind of changed things. Maybe he could have gone off into a corner somewhere where surely nobody's going to notice him there, and he could pray completely in secret for those 30 days. But at this point, any change would have been a compromise and would only have been self-serving. There was no reason to change anything. This was my devotion to God. If I change it now, the only thing he is doing is he is serving himself. He's making a compromise. For Daniel, this was an issue of, do I please God or do I please man? Do I obey God or do I obey the government? To obey God, put his life on the line, but he trusted God with the outcome. I don't know about you, but if a den of lions was potentially in my near future, I think the temptation might be there to do things just a little bit differently. But not Daniel. The temptation? Yes. Was he going to change? Not on your life. Notice verse 11. Then these men, once again, these men, this 122 guys, they assembled. They just burst in on Daniel, and they found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. Why did they just burst in? Because they knew he was going to be there doing it. Why? Because that's the character of Daniel. We know in the morning he's going to pray, in the evening he's going to pray, at noon he's going to be praying. We know where he's going to be praying. We know the position he's going to be in. We know what direction he's going to be facing. This is a done deal. Verse 12, then they came near and spake before the king concerning the king's decree. Hast thou not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of any god or man within 30 days, save of thee, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, this thing is true according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. Verse 13, then answered they and said before the king, that Daniel. See, they don't like Daniel. That Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity of Judah. He's a foreigner. He's a slave. He's supposed to be a prisoner. That Daniel regardeth not thee, O king, nor the decree that thou hast signed. Now, was that first part true? No. Daniel regarded the king. He was the most faithful subject in all of the kingdom. But the second part is true. Regardeth not the decree that thou hast signed, but maketh his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was sore displeased with himself. He realized at that moment, I've been duped. I let my ego get in the way, and I signed this thing too quickly without thinking about all this. Why? He liked Daniel. And he wanted to put Daniel over the entire realm of the Medo-Persian Empire. So he's close to Daniel at this time. And notice it says, verse 14, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. And he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. What's he doing? He's looking for a loophole here. He's going through the books trying to figure out, is there any way to undo this or to get Daniel out? You know what else is interesting here is that at no time during this is there any indication that Daniel tried to defend himself? And how often does that happen? Somebody gets accused of something and they come before the courts and they are guilty. And what is the plea? No, I didn't do it, right? I'm sure you heard that enough times in the jail. So what'd you do? Oh, I didn't do anything. I'm innocent. Heard it a lot. There's one man that I think was actually innocent when I used to go and preach in the prisons. One man, I think, that was actually innocent. Most of the other guys, like, whatever, man. Just go back to your hole somewhere. Daniel did not try to defend himself, and he was guilty. He knew he was guilty. That's why he doesn't defend himself. He knows he is in violation of the law. And that's why we see with Peter, and he was going to accept the consequences. That's why in 1 Peter 2:13, he does not say, obey every ordinance of man, but submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as the supreme. He says to submit to it. He doesn't say to obey it. Because there are some things that we cannot obey, but we do have to submit and accept the consequences when they come our way. And this is exactly where Daniel is. Like the 3 men in the furnace in chapter 3, Daniel had confidence that God was able to deliver him, and even if he doesn't, he was still going to be faithful, and he was going to trust God with the outcome, because that is the most important thing, is that I am faithful to God. These guys knew what the king was doing. They saw him going through the books, and notice in verse 15, they remind him, then these men assembled unto the king, and said unto the king, know, O king, that the law of the Medes and Persians is that no decree nor statute which the king establisheth may be changed. So they see the king going through all the books. They know what he's doing, and so they come in one more time and say, now, king, remember, there's nothing you can do here. Daniel's done for. We're so sorry. I mean, he was such a good guy. We hate to see this happening to him. And so notice the penalty that Daniel faces. Verse 16. Then the king commanded, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the lion's den. Now, well, let me try to describe this just a little bit to you so you kind of get the picture of what's going on here. The lion's den was like a big pit in a hill. They would make some sort of a hill. They would dig a kind of a big hole down to it, and at the bottom there would be this big pit divided by a wall with a door in it that they could use, with a rope or chain of some kind, they could lift that door up from the top. And on the other side of this door had all these lions that were starved on purpose for the purpose of execution. So this is what's going on. They bring Daniel, they cast him down into the pit, but they haven't lifted the door yet. So Daniel's in the pit. They're going to lift the door. And so Daniel's in the pit of lions. It says, "Now the king spake and said unto Daniel, Thy God, whom thou servest continually, he will deliver thee." So these are real lions, okay? These aren't, this isn't just getting put in prison. These aren't old, toothless, weak lions, as some people want to say. Well, that's how Daniel got out, because these were old, weak, toothless lions. And what we're going to see is there is a whole bunch of lions. You know, you see in pictures in a movie sometimes that there's just one lion, or there might be 2 or 3 lions in there. There was a whole bunch of them in here. We'll see that in just a second. And so now the door's lifted, the lions can come out. That's essentially what's going on here. And verse 17, "And a stone was brought and laid upon the mouth of the den." So now they're making extra sure there's no way Daniel's going to get out of this, because they would design this so people could watch these attacks go on. But they bring a stone and put over this hole down into the pit because they want to make sure there's no way Daniel's coming out and nobody's going to go in and get him or send a rope down or anything like that. They want to make sure that this guy's gone. So they bring that over the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet and the signet of his lords, that the purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. So the king seals it, so the other lords can't change anything. The lords seal it, so the king can't change it. So there's no way he's getting out of this. Verse 18. "Then the king went to his palace and passed the night fasting. Neither were instruments, music brought before him, and his sleep went from him." So he's really disturbed. "Then the king arose very early in the morning." That's first light. As soon as the sun starts to come up, the king gets out of bed, he rushes. It says, "And went in haste unto the den of lions. And when he came to the den, he cried with a lamentable voice unto Daniel. And the king spake and said, to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions?" And I think when he got there, he's expecting the best. But he's kind of prepared himself for the worst, because it's with a lamentable cry, "Oh, Daniel, did you make it? Are you still there?" Then said Daniel unto the king, "O king, live forever." And what's interesting here is Daniel has spent an entire lifetime, basically, in the king's palace. And spent one night with the lions. And you know where he was safest? He was in the safest place he could be that night. It was more safe for him with the lions than it was with those 122 other guys that were wanting him dead. The safest place to be is right where God wants you. And notice what he says, verse 22. "My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before thee, O king, have I done no hurt." Now he begins to defend himself. After the consequences have come around, and God has justified him in a sense. And what a defense. And if he had done anything wrong, and God was going to chasten him, this is the perfect opportunity for God to do it while he's in the lion's den, is it not? And if Daniel had been killed, that would have, he was definitely guilty. But God justified him. God proved him. And what else is interesting to consider is that while this conversation is going on between Daniel and the king, the lions have not gone back into their pit and the door closed. They're still out here where everybody can see them. This is what we need to understand. Verse 23, "Then was the king exceeding glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den." And it's interesting because when you consider how they're going to get him out, you can just imagine the king giving the order, "Okay, get him out of there." And guys looking back and forth at each other, "You go in with the lions, I'm not going in there. No, you go in there, I'm not going in there." And so finally, after all this arguing, a rope or something comes down to get Daniel. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. This deliverance was a vindication of his great faith. He had true faith in God, and God blessed that. But also with that, let me remind you that it doesn't always happen this way. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 33, it talks about those of great faith who through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions. That's Daniel. But then on the flip side of that, verse 36, he says, and others had trial of cruel mockings and scourging, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned. They were sawn asunder. They were tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, tormented. And when it talks about sheepskins and goatskins, they would take a wet animal hide and they would sew it to your skin real tight. And so as that animal hide began to dry, it would pull your skin open and rip through your skin. It says, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these having obtained a good report through faith. And Paul believed God, but he lost his head. Peter believed God, and he was crucified upside down. Believing God doesn't always mean that the lions don't eat you. The issue is that we be faithful to the Lord and accept the outcome no matter what it is. In Romans 14, verse 8, Paul says, for whether we live unto the Lord. Whether we die unto the Lord. Whether we live, therefore, or die, we are the Lord's. That's the attitude that Paul had. You know, and either way, we're not defeated. I mean, think of if Daniel did get killed by the lions, where was he going to go? He was going to go to be with the Lord. What better? Was that scary? Now, obviously, death doesn't scare me, but sometimes I think the lions might make me a little bit intimidated. But notice the king's response here, verse 24, and this is so interesting. And the king commanded, and they brought those men which had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the dens of lions, and their children, and their wives. So the lions hadn't gone out yet. They're still down here in this pit around where everybody can see them, waiting for their meal. Now, it's interesting because 3 times before this, they go to the king and say, now, the law of the Medes and the Persians, it can't be altered. The law of the Medes and the Persians can't be altered. Remember, king, this cannot be changed. Do you think they were so meticulous about this at this point when they're about to be thrown in? The law of the Medes and Persians also said that when somebody is accused, or when they're convicted, that they, their wife, and their children are to suffer the same punishment. And so the king, well, this is the law of Medes and Persians. You and your whole family's going in. So this is a lot of people. You think there's 122 guys, plus probably one wife each, so another 122 women, plus however many kids they had. So you're looking at several hundred people going down into this pit. And listen to what it says. And the lions had the mastery of them and break all their bones in pieces, or ever they came at the bottom of the den. Before they hit the ground, every single person had all their bones broken. That is a lot of lions. It wasn't just 1 or 2. This den was filled with them. Notice verse 25. Then the king Darius wrote unto all people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied unto you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, and steadfast forever. And his kingdom, that which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall be even unto the end. He delivereth and rescueth. He worketh signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who hath delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. One man made a tremendous impact upon 2 kingdoms. You know, it doesn't take a whole lot of people. Sometimes we think, well, if we could just get a whole bunch of Christians to do something, together we could actually do something here in whatever. It doesn't take a whole bunch of people. It takes one person, but it has to be the right kind of person. It has to be somebody who is faithful to serve God no matter what, and they leave the consequences up to God.